Mark's Gospel, chapter 8, and beginning with verse 34. And I always think about this verse when we start a new year. This might seem like a strange verse to think about in the new year, but I'll explain it in just a moment. The reason is whenever we have, whenever there's New Year's Eve and New Year's Day, and we think about a whole new year starting, generally people make New Year's resolutions, and we make these promises. I was going to say these empty promises that we never keep, but that's kind of how it works out sometimes. We make promises, we endeavor to make resolutions to do things differently many times. And now, am I right about that? Don't we sometimes do that? And we think about that when the new year's starting. We think we're going to do things different. But what that reminds me of, it seems as though we're always trying to change something about our lives. We're always trying to make some kind of change. And this shows up in all kinds of different ways. Maybe it's we want to get rid of some what we perceive to be bad habits, or start some good habits, whatever that might be. Or sometimes it's want to change our diet or an exercise program. But we always want to change something somehow about our lives. And I think the reason is, if you stop and think about it, we don't usually just think about why that is. I think there's an instinctive sense that changes need to be made sometimes in our lives. The change is necessary. And so we endeavor to do it, to make those changes, and in all kinds of different areas, in all kinds of different ways. But the problem is when we make efforts at change in our lives, and I'll just turn it down just a little here because I can hear it ring. When we make efforts to make changes in our lives, let's just be honest, we're limited because we're human. We're fallible, we're fail, and that's why I was making that little joke a while ago about we make New Year's resolutions and generally they never pan out. I know that's true of me when I've tried to do that. This year I'm going to whatever it is, and then I do pretty good for a week or two. But so you see, we are limited, or let's just put it this way: the success of our efforts at self-change, the success is limited by our capacity, our human strength and willpower. And there are limits to both those things. But the message of the gospel, listen to this carefully, the message of the gospel is not, you need to change your life. The message of the gospel is, it's an invitation, let's put it this way, to exchange your life. We sometimes say as Christians, we Christians have a changed life. And that's really not accurate. What we have is an exchanged life. And it makes a big difference to think of it this way. And I like to read this verse, this couple of verses here, to make this point. Let me just read now from Mark's Gospel, chapter 8. Did I say 9? I meant 8 if I said. What did I say? Did I say 8? Okay, thank you. Verse 34. Jesus said, here's what it says. And when he had called the people unto him, and his disciples also, he said unto them, Whosoever will come after me, let him deny himself, and take up his cross, and follow me. For whosoever shall save his life, will save his life, shall lose it. But whosoever shall lose his life for my sake and the gospel's, the same shall save it. And I'll stop right there for a moment. We haven't always been doing this church. Earlier in my Christian life, of course, what we do, we attend church, and because I'm a musician, I was in the worship team, or the musician, the group of musicians at a particular church, and just like here when we sing, the musicians up at the front, and I remember in this one particular situation, the musicians were up on the platform, up on the raised, thing, and we were sitting here looking out at the audience, at the congregation. And I remember this one particular occasion where at the practice, different churches have different ways of doing things, and the practice of this one particular church was they had a little program of things to do, and there would be a verse, a Bible verse, or a couple maybe, every Sunday that would be designated, and some member of the congregation would have the task or the job or the opportunity, however you want to look at it, to read to recite or to say it. You get to say the verse, just some picked up verse. So I remember on this one particular Sunday, these two verses that I just read to you were the selected verses. And so we came to that part of the service, and the person whose job it was printed in the little program, and so they read it in a loud enough voice everybody could hear it. Whosoever will come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross, and whosoever shall save his life will lose it. Whosoever will lose his life for my sake and the gospel shall save it. And I remember looking out the congregation, and everybody's face looked like this. Like, thanks a lot. That's really great, because something about that strikes us as though it's something bad. Now, on this, the last one especially, where it says, whosoever will save his life will lose it. I think that's all we see, lose. But see, here's what it says, whoever will lose his life for my sake, the same shall save it. Now, really what he's saying, and this is sort of a paradoxical statement, you know, it requires some thought, or it requires some interpretation. Now, Jesus is good at this. He liked to teach this way with these little paradoxical statements, or parables. He liked to teach in parables. He wasn't always very direct with what he said. And there's reasons for doing it that way. Lots of reasons. I don't want to start talking about, now that I said that, I was getting ready to go get distracted by all the reasons why he did it. But let's just agree that he did teach that way, by parables and paradoxical statements. Now, you have to admit this is a kind of a paradoxical statement. Now, let me just suggest to you what he's saying in this statement, which seems a little perplexing. He says, whoever will save his life will lose it, but whoever will lose his life for my sake and the gospel's, the same shall save it. Really what he's talking about is the opportunity to exchange. To exchange, to lose your life, but have, when he says whoever will lose his life for my sake and the gospel shall save it, he's saying you're going to lose something, but you're going to save or obtain something, let's suggest better. You're going to get something better from it. And really, when he says, for my sake and the gospel's, what he's saying is, because of our relationship with Jesus, we're going to lose our, can I say it this way? We're going to exchange our old life for a new life of his, if I can say it that way. And by the way, when he says, for my sake and the gospel's, is where this is going to take place. We lose our life and gain, see, then it's a question mark. We think, what is it that we gain? He says, you're going to save it. It's an exchange that takes place. Back in the previous verse, he makes it clear what causes the exchange in verse 34. He says, let him take up his cross and follow me. Now, we'll talk about that in just a second, but here's what the point of it is. An exchange takes place when we become Christians. An exchange takes place, a change takes place. Now, that's an exchange is what I want to say. The important thing about that is this. See, it's not that our lives need to be fixed up or straightened out. They just need to be exchanged. It's like if you bought a product at the store and you got it home and it didn't work at all, or there were problems with it, or defective. You know what people do right after Christmas. You know, I happen to go to Walmart and to do some shopping. But I'll tell you where they were really busy was at that exchange counter. You know, up at the front, there was a line going clear back out to the to the goods on the shelf there, because people either got things they didn't want or got things that didn't work, or for whatever reason. But that's what we do. If something's defective, we take it back to where we got it and exchange it for, hopefully, for one that does work. Now, when we recognize the fact that in our lives changes need to be made, God's answer for it, Jesus' answer for it, is not, well, let me help you tinker around with it and make a few little changes. He just says, if I can paraphrase it, just bring it back in, and I'll exchange it for you, and I'll give you a new one. And that's exactly what happens. He doesn't ask us to fix our defective lives, but he invites us to exchange our defective lives for his perfect one. Now, here's where the point of exchange takes place. Notice what he says here. Whosoever will come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. Now, again, this is a little bit of a paradoxical statement. It's a metaphorical statement, because we don't literally take up a cross. We don't literally do that. And if we did, we'd be we'd have a big wooden cross on our back, and we'd be walking around with that. And even if you did that, that doesn't necessarily make any changes in your life, right? And I think I've mentioned this before. I've read to you before. I have a little news story I carry in the back of my Bible just for when this comes up. We don't literally even crucify ourselves. And do you remember? Everybody heard me read this? I've got it right here. If you want to hear it, I'll read it to you again. But about this man who tried to crucify. He built a cross in his house. I bet Brian had never heard this. I'm going to read it for Brian's sake. I bet you haven't heard this before. Look at this. I printed this out. Listen to this. Man treated after attempting to nail himself to a cross. That got my attention when I saw that on Say, a Heartland man was treated in a Pittsfield hospital after he nailed himself to a cross. The 23-year-old man apparently was trying to commit suicide Thursday evening in his living room, the Bangor Daily News said. Somerset